Hi there, this is Jessica Shunke of Blue Sky Modern Craft, and I just wanted to put together a quick little video of how I do my quilt binding in case it's helpful. I know that there are a lot of videos out there, but everybody does it, a little bit differently, and I just thought I would show you this way in case it's of use to you at all. So when I attach my binding, I always attach it to the front of the quilt. This is the front you're looking at here first. And then fold it around to the back, and I either then hand stitch it down. I usually use big stitch binding with embroidery thread or sashiko thread, or I will attach it by machine using a stitch in the ditch needle that I then stitch in the front, and then the thread will catch the binding on the back. We'll start with how it looks on the front, and you can certainly do this in the reverse order if you're someone who prefers to attach it to the back and then wrap it around to the front instead. It's totally fine. It won't change a whole lot except for which part of your quilt is facing up when you start. So I tend to cut my binding at 2 3/8 inches. Most people do it somewhere between 2 1/4 and 2 1/2. I kind of split the difference at 2 3/8. Gives me a little extra wiggle room when I'm wrapping it around to the back to make sure that I catch it. But it's not quite as thick as 2 1/2, so it's a little bit thinner. Any of them will work, using the same method, so it's kind of up to you. One tip that I always suggest is that before you start to attach your binding, you take just a few extra minutes to lay your quilt out on the ground and wrap your lay your binding on top of it the way that you are planning to attach it. So usually I start on the right hand side of the quilt somewhere, kind of middle to lower middle part of it, and then I will lay the binding down to the corner, flip it, and then keep going all the way around the quilt. And the reason I do this is to make sure that I don't wind up with any mitered seams, or any seams in the corners, because if you do, that really gets kind of in your way when you go to miter the corners later on. It just makes for a really thick corner, and it's a little trickier, and usually they end up getting kind of bulky and not very attractive. So if you lay it out first and you can make sure that none of the seams are going to fall in the corner, it'll make for some more attractive corners later on. And if you lay it out and you find that you do have a seam in the corner, then you can easily just adjust it by moving the binding so it starts a little bit higher up on the quilt or a little bit lower, depending on what you need to do, and you can kind of play around with it. So that's why I have this guy clipped here, so I know exactly where I laid it out and where I need to start. So when you start, I usually start with somewhere between 8 and 12 inches. It's not an exact science, but a decent amount left over at the beginning, and then I'm going to start stitching right here. I like to use my walking foot when I'm attaching binding. I just find it to be easier and more accurate, and I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch seam on this. So on my foot, that means that the fabric is going to line up with the inside of this little hole here. So I'll show you. Oops, sorry. Okay, so you can see now that the fabric is lined up right with the inside of this hole. It doesn't have to be completely exact, but certainly the more accurately you attach your binding to the front, the better it's going to look when you wrap it around to the back, because the more even it's going to be. But at the same time, don't super stress yourself out about it, because if it gets a little bit off, you're going to be okay. I use a 2.4 inch on my machine stitch length to attach most of the binding. I'll show you where I change it. And then that's about it. So I'm going to stitch, I'm going to start here and back stitch, and then I'm going to just sew straight down the side of this quilt, 1/4 inch seam allowance, until I get down to this corner. And I'm going to stop, sorry, I'm trying to show you here. I'm going to stop when I get a 1/4 inch from the bottom. On my machine, I've got a little mark here, if you can see. I've got 2 marks. This is the second one is this 1/4 inch. So I know when I get to the corner, when the bottom of the quilt is at this bottom one, is when my needle is going to be a 1/4 inch from the corner. So I use that to eyeball it. If you don't have a marking on your machine, you can certainly you know, measure it and just use a pin to make a marking here so you know where to stop, or you can just eyeball it. If it's a little more than a 1/4 inch, that's not a real problem. You don't want it to be less than a 1/4 inch though, because again, that's going to mess up the corner of your binding, and it's going to look a little messier because it's going to be a little bit smushed. So start up here, back stitch, 1/4 inch seam all the way down to the bottom, stop a 1/4 inch from the bottom, and then we'll pick back up there. Okay, so we're down at the corner, and you can see the edge of my quilt here is right about that 1/4 inch mark. It's just over it, and that's fine. So I've stopped. My needle is in the down position here. I'm now going to go over to my stitch length setting, and I like to bump it down to 2 just to give myself a little more security in the corner. I'm going to lift my foot up and rotate the quilt around. Sorry, switch hands here. Rotate the quilt around, so now my binding is going to go out to the right here, or to the left, excuse me, and the quilt is over here to the right. Okay, and we're going at a 90-degree angle from where I was just stitching. So I'm going to lower my foot, and I'm just going to stitch straight ahead to the end, which here is about 3 stitches with that 2 inch or 2.0 stitch length. Then I'm going to back stitch those same 3 stitches, and then I'm going to stitch forward again, just straight off the edge of the quilt. Okay, now before I forget, I'm going to go ahead and raise my stitch length back up to 4, or 2.4. If you forget and you keep stitching at 2, it's not the end of the world. It means your binding is probably going to be a little more secure. But if you remember to do it, you know, a little bit higher stitch length might make it a little easier for your layers to move under the needle. So now we're going to lift up the walking foot again and rotate the quilt back around. Notice I haven't clipped my threads, so there's where I just stitched off, and I've still got the thread attached. I'm going to pull the quilt away from the needle a little bit. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. I'm going to take my loose binding here, and we're going to fold it up here at perpendicular to where it just was, so it'll be nice and straight along the top. So I'm going to go this way, and then fold it back on top of itself like that. So it's then, you know, now going to go down the next side of the quilt, but you can see that it's wrapped up on top of itself. Okay, so now you can see I've turned the quilt around. You can see how I've folded that binding so it's back up on top of itself there. And then, you know, laid out so it's straight along this next side. I've got the needle down right at the end, and I'm going to sew again with that 1/4 inch seam. So when I start here in a second, I'll forward stitch a little bit, then back stitch off of the quilt, and then forward stitch and keep going all along this side until I get to the next corner, and I will treat it the exact same way. And you're going to keep going like this until you get back around to the side that you started on, and then you're going to stop your sewing about 15 or so inches, kind of depends a little bit on the size of your quilt, but around 15 inches from where you started, and you'll back stitch and then take the quilt off of the machine, and I'll show you how to connect the 2 ends of the binding. Okay, so now I've attached the quilt, or the binding to the quilt. It's, like I said, about 15 inches between the 2 sides, and I've laid it out on my cutting mat, taken it off the machine, laid it out on the cutting mat. So I'll start with the bit that I began with, and it's hard to get far enough away. I will lay it out so it's covering, you know, the open space, and I'll find about halfway through, or about the middle of the open space, which is around here, and I'm going to go ahead and trim this piece so I won't have that part on top of it. Okay, so we're back here. So I've trimmed this first piece off now so that it ends in, you know, roughly the middle of the open section. It doesn't have to be exact, but more or less in the middle. Then take a small ruler, and I like to lay it out on my cutting mat, and I will line the point up, line the end of this strip up with whatever the width of your binding is. So if you're using 2.5 inch binding, you'll line it up with 2.5, 2 1/4, you'll line it up with 2 1/4. As I said earlier, I like to use 2 3/8, so I find the 2 3/8 mark and line it up with the end of this first binding that I've trimmed already, and I leave it there. Take the other piece of binding and lay it out on top of the first piece so that they overlap. Then you're going to take your scissors and you're going to cut just this top piece, so the longer piece that you just laid out on top. Double check that your ruler hasn't moved. You're going to cut this top piece right where the ruler ends, okay, so that they're going to overlap by the amount of by the width of your binding. So in this case, they're going to overlap by 2 3/8 inches. This is not kind of an unfortunate seam here, but it'll be fine. Okay. So you're going to trim there, and then you can just discard your extra there. You can move that away. So now I've got my 2 strips here. Okay. You're going to take this is in my right hand, take the one in your right hand and press it, or push it so that it's perpendicular with the one in your left hand. And this is where a lot of people get mixed up because they get their binding twisted. So if they're laid out here again, I'll show you. Take the one in your right hand and kind of turn it under and put it right sides together, perpendicular with the one in the left one, okay? And you can double check it, because if I hold that in place and I lay it back out, I can see that everything's upright the way it should be. So now I'm going to pin these really well so they don't move around when you're going to sew these together. And then once you do this, you're going to take it back to your machine and you're going to sew a diagonal seam across this, just like as if you were making, you know, binding to begin with, like attaching the different strips of binding together. A diagonal seam that's going to go from this top corner down to this corner. So a diagonal seam right across there. Obviously take your pins out as you're sewing. Once you do that, you've got your seam here. Then you're going to trim outside that seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I just grab my scissors and eyeball it. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not a big deal. And then you can either take it to your machine and press it open if you feel really strongly about it, or I usually just finger press it open, and that is sufficient. And then you will lay your binding back out. It obviously won't be all pinned like this. Lay your binding back out, and then you will just start sewing back here again. So with that 1/4 inch seam all the way till the end, and make sure you back stitch at both ends, and you will have your binding all attached to the front of your quilt. After that, when you're done, I like to iron my binding so that it's really nice and flat. And then you will, you know, turn it over to the back side. And like I said, you can hand stitch it at this point. You can machine stitch it on the back if you like, and just stitching straight along the edge. You'll obviously see the thread on the front if you do that, but if you do it neatly, the thread should fall, you know, just in about here, and it will mostly disappear. Make sure you choose a thread that's going to blend with your quilt top as much as possible. Otherwise, the way I like to do it is I have a stitch in the ditch foot, so I will pin my binding down, or I use Wonder Clips generally, and then I will stitch from the front with my stitch in the ditch foot going right along the inside of the binding. It will then catch the binding on the back with my thread, and because it's a stitch in the ditch, that seam on the front of the quilt really just disappears, and it's super nice. So I find it to also be really fast and the most accurate way I've found to machine stitch. So if your machine has a stitch in the ditch foot, definitely now's the time to take it out and give it a try. A lot of people have never tried one, or didn't even know necessarily if their machine has one. I'll show you what it looks like, or at least what mine looks like. So it's like this. Oops, there we go. It's got this little flange that goes right down the middle of the foot. And so when you're stitching that flange, it just will guide right along the binding. And really, when you then take it away, the thread will just really disappear into the binding, and it's almost invisible on the front and really neat on the back. So highly recommend giving it a try if you haven't. But again, feel free to finish attaching it however you prefer. Thanks so much.